So to get us caught up and back on track with the syllabus, I will have video lectures for chapters 8 and 9. So first we'll look at chapter 8, the emergence of a market economy. In the first half of the 19th century, economic changes called by historians the market revolution transformed the United States. Innovations in transportation and communication sparked these changes. In the colonial era, technology had barely advanced. Ships did not become faster. No canals were built. Manufacturing was done by hand, and roads were little more than paths. The market revolution, though, accelerated changes already underway in the colonial era. Slave labor had long driven cash crop plantations, and consumer goods were a major part of the economy and political bargaining. In 1800, most families were not tied to the marketplace, used little cash, and produced much of what they needed at home. It was nearly impossible for farmers far from cities or waterways to get their produce to market. The first advance in overland transportation was the construction of toll roads, called turnpikes, by private companies and state and local governments. These were largely ineffective because even on better roads, horse-drawn wagons were still an inefficient mode of transport. It was improved water transportation that more effectively sped up and lowered the cost of commerce. In 1807, on the Hudson River in New York, the first steamboat, built by Robert Fulton, went into operation. Steamboats made possible upstream navigation and rapid transport across the Great Lakes and eventually the Atlantic Ocean. In 1825, the Erie Canal in upstate New York was completed. The canal facilitated the settlement of upstate New York and the Old Northwest, and helped foster trade between farmers in the West and manufacturers in the East. The connection to the Old Northwest made New York City the dominant port. The federal government of the era was generally unwilling to fund internal improvements, and the responsibility fell to the states. The Erie Canal inspired a craze of canal building by state and local governments, many of which went bankrupt during the Depression after the Panic of 1837. And just here we have a watercolor from 1829 by John William Hill. Depicts the Erie Canal 5 years after it opened. Boats carrying passengers and goods traversed the waterway along whose banks farms and villages began to spring up. While canals connected only existing waterways, railroads opened vast new areas of the interior while stimulating coal mining for fuel and iron manufacturing, for locomotives and rail. Work on the first railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio began in 1828. By 1860, the nation's rail network was 30,000 miles long, more than the total in the rest of the world combined. At the same time, the invention of the telegraph in the 1830s by Samuel F. B. Morse allowed for instantaneous communication. First used commercially in 1844, the telegraph served businesses and newspapers by helping to speed the flow of information and bringing uniformity to prices, and would eventually serve as communication for individuals. Transportation and communication improvements fostered the growth of the West as a new region. Between 1790 and 1840, around 4.5 million people crossed the Appalachian Mountains, much of it after the War of 1812, when land-hungry Easterners moved west. Between 1815 and 1821, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, Alabama, Mississippi, and Maine became states. 3 different streams of settlers moved west. Small farmers and planters with slaves in the South who created the Cotton Kingdom of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas. Farm families from the Upper South who moved to southern Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and New Englanders who moved across New York to northern Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. National boundaries did not prevent American settlement. In Florida, and later in Texas and Oregon, American settlers claimed land ruled by foreign countries, Spain, Mexico, and Britain, or Indian tribes. They were confident that American sovereignty would follow. American settlers and military incursions, some led by Andrew Jackson, led to the acquisition of Spanish Florida by 1819 and the Adams-Onis Treaty. By 1840, 7 million Americans, about 2/5 of the total population, lived west of the Appalachian Mountains. Furthermore, the careers of the era's leading public figures reflected the westward movement, with Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, and others having been born in Atlantic coast states, but making their mark in politics after moving west. Before the War of 1812, the Old Northwest was a prime example of a borderland with American Indian, French, English, and American cultures meeting along unstable boundaries. The American victory over the British and Indians established United States dominance, but a new borderland developed. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 prohibited slavery in the Old Northwest, making the Ohio River the boundary between free and slave societies. But for many years it was easier for people and goods to travel between slave state Kentucky and southern Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois than it was for movement between the area and the northern parts of these states. The southern portions of these states came to have more in common with Kentucky and Tennessee than the northern counties of their own territory. New Englanders settled in the northern parts of the states, while Southerners who shipped their goods southward rather than northward or eastward settled in the southern portions of the states. The concentration of Southerners made Illinois and Indiana key political backgrounds during the emerging slavery controversy. The market revolution and westward expansion occurred simultaneously in the North and South, heightening section divisions. In some ways, the most dynamic feature of the American economy in the first 30 years of the 19th century was the rise of the Cotton Kingdom. The early Industrial Revolution began in England and spread to the North. where it centered on textile factories that demanded huge amounts of cotton, a crop for which the Deep South was suited. In 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin for separating seeds from the fibers, a laborious process that slowed the marketing of cotton. Now the crop could be produced and marketed on a much larger scale. Coupled with rising demand for cotton and newly opened land in the West, the cotton gin revolutionized American slavery. Expected to die out because tobacco exhausted the soil, slavery instead expanded with cotton plantations spreading into South Carolina. South Carolina reopened the African slave trade between 1803 and 1808, before Congress banned it in 1808, the earliest date allowed by the Constitution, after which a massive internal trade developed. After the War of 1812, the United States consolidated control over the Deep South and acquired Florida, forcing Indians to cede lands for white settlement, and thus the expansion of cotton production and slavery.